Thank you for joining us today for today's ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Commission on Immigration program, How Things Work, the Legal Edition, which is a rapid response project that addresses how our civil rights are being impacted by actions taken by the new administration. My name is Carla McCanders, Director of the Thurgood Marshall Institute with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
And my name is Valeria Gomez. I'm an assistant professor of law and the director of the Immigrant Justice and Immigrant Rights Clinic at the University of Baltimore School of Law. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation. These videos are a unique opportunity to address what is happening in America today, to clarify any misinformation or disinformation being spread, and how civil rights and social justice advocates can act to protect the rights of everyone. So today's topic, civil rights under threat, protecting communities from ICE raids, is more critical than ever. As we confront increased and more aggressive immigration enforcement, it's essential to examine how these issues intersect with the principles of justice and equity that guide in the work of our sections and the ABA generally. So without further ado, let's dive in.
So, Valeria, can you explain the policy, the mandate, the law behind these raids?
Yeah, so the sort of overarching kickstart to all of this was the executive order that went into effect after the president was inaugurated. That was specifically the Protecting American People Against Invasion executive order, which, without getting into much detail, essentially allowed and ordered the immigration and enforcement agencies to engage in enforcement activities to the fullest extent possible under the law, at least as they interpreted it. So related to that, then we start looking at some mass enforcement today. And as today's topic talks about raids, when Carla and I were talking, we were thinking about the fact that even the definition of a raid has expanded. We have workforce enforcement raids when people and in those situations, we see that state law enforcement is cooperating with the immigration customs enforcement agents and agencies. And in our more recent past, maybe like today, we're starting to see mass enforcement really expand. So, for example, one of the things that has happened since this executive order went into effect is that there is no longer what's referred to as a sensitive location protection. So this administration has gotten rid of essentially enforcement policies that limited or really forbade enforcement agencies going into hospitals, schools, churches, areas of general protest. And so now we're seeing an increase of what may be referred to as a street raid, where enforcement agencies are going more aggressively, even out on the streets, inquiring about people's immigration status, or maybe even just starting to arrest people before they ascertain specifically what immigration status might be. That's something that's probably is going to be increasing because of a recent Supreme Court case, Vasquez Perdomo v. Noam, which basically removed limits on ICE for profiling in immigration-related stops. So that is likely to that has essentially kind of increased the ability for ICE to go forward and start making assessments about people without much information. We're also seeing increased, as I mentioned before, increased state and federal collaboration. So there has been a significant increase in 287G agreements, which are essentially agreements with which the federal government deputizes state law enforcement agencies to engage in immigration enforcement activities. And so we've seen, I think out of some of the more recent numbers, close to 900 agreements now with state jurisdictions, which is a very significant increase. And what that sometimes leads to is, because of these agreements that empower state agencies and state law enforcement officers to engage in immigration enforcement activities, an increase of, say, enforcing traffic stops under the guise of enforcing traffic laws, but really motivated towards enforcing immigration laws and inquiring about people's immigration status while they're going about their day. We've seen increasing deployment of National Guard in Washington, D.C., and threatening to deploy in other states and cities in the United States. More recently in the news, we've seen Memphis and Portland, Oregon among those lists of people. And also we've seen an increase of ICE targeting people at their residences. I think even very recently there was news about a large enforcement operation that took place at an apartment complex in Chicago, again in an attempt to dragnet essentially as many people as possible. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And Carla, I wanted to throw it back to you. How do you see the administration's actions impacting everyday life?
So they're impacting everyone across the board. If we start with looking at immigration court, there are hearings with no due process. We know that under the Constitution, Fifth Amendment, all persons have the right to a hearing. In immigration court, you have the right to an attorney without cost to the government and the right to present evidence. This is being severely restricted from detention facilities, people not having access to call and speak with their attorneys. We also know that the immigration court has been disrupted. A lot of immigration judges have stepped down or have been fired or forced into retirement because they don't agree with this administration's policy. So due process rights have been severely curtailed. Also, there is increased detention because of a recent change in BIA precedent, the Board of Immigration Appeals. There are significant limitations on immigration judges issuing bonds. As Valeria mentioned, the recent Supreme Court case has increased racial profiling, and profiling and stereotyping tend to work in tandem with each other. So ICE is essentially given a carte blanche to engage in stereotyping behavior. And what we know is that you cannot tell someone's immigration status by just looking at them. And so this gives, ICE, the people, the state's troopers who are collaborating with ICE, a carte blanche to engage in stereotyping behavior. Also, protest in Oregon recently, in California, Los Angeles in June, we see that um, federal agents are deployed for protests at ICE facilities. So we see the increase of immigration enforcement, federal enforcement into the area of um, protests, which is, really curtailing people's First Amendment rights to be able to speak out against government actions that they disagree with. So across the board, it is impacting everyone's civil rights and civil liberties. We often think that it's just going to be certain immigrant communities, but it's, with the increased enforcement inside neighborhoods, we're seeing that all people are being impacted.
And if we were to think about the communities that are impacted and affected, we've talked about how it would be all in all communities. Is there anyone in particular that might be impacted?
One thing that we need to pay attention to is that like I said, you can't tell someone's immigration status from just looking at them. So this leaves the door open for all non-white presenting people to be targeted. And, we see with the increased enforcement on the streets, this involves, you know, checkpoints in the DC area where you have DC under occupation, and checkpoints and stops for citizens. So it's also important to note that the lawsuit that you mentioned, Vasquez, was brought by all citizens because everyone realizes that, you know, even if it is stated that certain communities are going to be targeted, it's impacting everyone in all communities. Um, and it's also important to note that it impacts children. So when a parent is detained or taken off the street, this is causing family separation. separation of children from their parents. And then another important note is that when we think about the geographic locations, it's really across the board. It's not limited to urban locations. There's state enforcement policies, as you have mentioned, have drastically increased. Florida now has 287 G agreements in all of its counties. So everyone is being impacted by this, and it's affecting everyone's daily lives.
Yeah. And even the models that are employed under 287G, they used to be mostly centered on those inspections by state officials happening once somebody was brought into a jail or prison center. But now we're seeing an increase in the task force model that allows those state law enforcement agencies to go out and actually engage on the street in some of their law enforcement agencies, which again, like it really is increasing that footprint, as you said.
Definitely. And when we think about raids or the increased enforcement, we're seeing them at workplaces, we're seeing like really on the street when we think about protests. There's the deployment of National Guards that certain state governors are authorizing National Guards to come into cities to militarize the response to protests when citizens are all persons, not just citizens, are going out and stating that they disagree with the policies that are being implemented. So, Valeria, what can lawyers and advocates or anyone really do to address this action and its impact? And what resources can we provide people to be able to protect civil liberties within our communities?
Yeah, well, this is definitely a time when I would say we're an all hands on deck situation. So even if you're not an immigration attorney, you can most definitely contribute to what is happening in terms of a response. So one example of that is that the ABA Commission on Immigration actually has an immigration court observation project. And that is a project where volunteers who can be lawyers, but they don't have to be, are trained through a module to observe immigration court hearings across the country, and not only to bear presence and witness to what is happening in immigration courts, which is where many people end up after they're engaged in and then detained in this enforcement type of operation. But it also actually, the module and the program has a program in place to where the people that are witnessing can also track the trends that are happening in immigration court, and they can support the transparency that so that people are bearing witness to what happens in immigration court. As you were saying earlier, we're seeing a decrease in due process in the immigration court proceedings as well, and a lot of pressure on judges from the administration to rule in a particular way or to accelerate hearings in a particular way. And so we can't know across the board what is happening unless we have an organized model for trying to witness and track some of these trends across the United States. So that's a very big one that people can do. And like I said, you don't have to be an immigration lawyer. You don't even have to be a lawyer, as long as you go through that very robust training process. Another thing, as we're thinking about what all of us can do, whether we're immigration lawyers or not, is thinking about maybe proactively and ahead of time what we might do if we are bystanders, if we're witnessing in our communities some of these street raids happening. For example, thinking ahead of time and maybe educating yourself about what the rules are in your particular state as it relates to recording. So generally speaking, recording is allowed when it relates to a law enforcement officer of any type executing their authorized activities out in the street. But thinking ahead about what are the maybe limitations, or what am I allowed to do as it relates to showing ID? If people are asking me, that can sometimes vary from state to state. But thinking ahead that sometimes some of these recordings can be helpful to people that are in immigration court, especially if the situation was especially egregious, so that there is some type of consequence in the immigration court proceedings, and maybe some people have some protection from what happened in the actual arrests that happen on the streets. As it relates to attorneys with federal litigation experience, they can make themselves available to their local immigration advocacy organizations or maybe their local immigration bar to be available for federal habeas petitions. So as you were noting, Carla, that because of some recent precedent, there has been an increase in immigration judges being told that they don't have the authority to grant bonds to people that are now
Mhm.
after arrest being held in immigration detention facilities. So for many people, the habeas corpus option, where the federal courts come in to try to limit what the government can do with the person that's been detained, can be some of the only options that people have in order to be released from immigration detention. For people that might be well versed in family law attorneys can help by giving their services for guardianships or safety preparation, either for people that are maybe more vulnerable to immigration enforcement or people that have already, unfortunately, had their families separated because of a street raid or any other type of enforcement operation. Many states have guardianships that can that are conditional, that can be triggered in the occasion of some kind of ICE family separation. And so looking into that can be something that is can be very helpful to communities who are in need. And then another resource that is available for the general population, and certainly our immigration attorneys in the community can help donate their services, are the ABA Detention Information Hotline, where volunteers actually take calls from individuals that are in immigration detention, that where it's really difficult usually for attorneys to make it to some of these spaces. These individuals can call this hotline to try to get information on what their legal rights are, what the conditions are for potential release, and to also report on what conditions are looking like in detention centers, which we have heard have become very crowded and are potentially deteriorating. And the last that I'll highlight is in the Baltimore area, there is a Safe City Baltimore legal screening hotline where, again, volunteers are conducting telephonic legal intakes to provide information for non-citizens in Baltimore City and to refer them to legal services where they might be able to get assistance either after or ahead of time to know what people's options are. So those are just a few, and probably in your community you have some similar programs, but those are some ideas for how people can get involved and try to assist.
Great. Thank you, Valeria. It's a all hands on deck. Everybody's impacted and everybody can participate in helping to facilitate change. To everyone who joined us today, thank you for being a part of this important dialogue. The issues we've explored are unprecedented in our lifetimes, complex and challenging. But by coming together in spaces like this, we're making meaningful steps towards progress. So remember, the work doesn't stop here, it continues with the actions we take in our communities, our workplace, and within the ABA.
I encourage you to stay engaged with the Commission on Immigration. Follow us on social media to learn more about the work and how you can support it. And you can also engage with the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section and become a member if you aren't one already. Visit our website, explore upcoming events, and consider joining one of our communities to help shelp the work that we're doing. You can do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. Once again, thank you for watching. Keep fighting. Together we can and we will make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you.